I would like to welcome you, John Bray, as a participant in the Oral History of Tibetan Studies project at Oxford, and we are very happy to have you included. And as you know, I would like to ask you about your life and how it relates to Tibetan studies.
Okay, thank you. Well, perhaps I could start by giving a kind of general introduction. I'm from the UK. I first went to India in the Himalayan region in 1978, and I spent 2 years in India then. That was straight after university. It was quite a formative period. My first year was at a school mainly for Tibetan refugees near Devon, and my second year was in Ladakh. I've been interested in the Ladakh especially, but the wider region ever since. There's a great deal of continuity. Since then, I've lived in the UK, but also 12 years in Japan, and now 3.5 years in Singapore, which is where I'm currently based.
So, John, could you tell us, could we start with your origin and family background? Where did you grow up?
Okay, I grew up in Devon, that's in the southwest of England. I was born in a country town called Crediton. My father was the local vicar, an Anglican priest. I went to 2 boarding schools and then afterwards to university in Cambridge, and I studied history in Cambridge. So I guess all those things in combination are the foundation.
And can I ask you about the childhood still a bit? Did you have any hobbies that might have influenced you then as a child? Or how was it growing up in Devon? Did you have siblings?
Yes, I have three older brothers. I guess relevant to this topic. The first book I read on Tibet, I remember quite clearly. It was Heinrich Harris, 7 Years in Tibet. And the second book belonged to my grandmother. It was also edited by Heinrich Harris. It was the Tibet is My Country by the Dalai Lama's elder brother. And the third and fourth books were by Michel Paisel. So I remember all those things quite clearly. So that would have been when I was about 10 or 11. So from that time, I definitely had an interest in Tibet and the Himalayan region. I guess I didn't have a chance to follow up the interest until after I left university. But Tibet was always there in my mind as a place which was of interest, which I would like to know about and learn about at some point.
And why did you find it interesting at this point?
Well, 7 years in Tibet, it's an intriguing story. It's an adventure story. I guess it's that as much as anything else. The mountains, the people he met on the way. Quite hard to put my finger on what precisely it was that caught my imagination, but anyway, it certainly did. Come to think of it, I remember another book. It was a book which I've heard quoted at a conference quite recently. It was Richardson Snellgrove, A Cultural History of Tibet. And I think my parents gave me a copy. I know my parents gave me a copy for Christmas. It was a discounted copy, sold cheap, but I still have it and value it. So that was another of my early books. I didn't necessarily understand it. I remember reading about the complicated spelling system. I looked at the pictures very clearly, very, very, very carefully. So I still have them quite firmly printed into my mind's eye.
How old were you at this time?
That Christmas, I can't remember exactly, but probably when I was about 12.
And you did your schooling in Devon?
Yes, but this is a strange English custom. I was sent to a boarding school quite young when I was actually not quite 10, 9, my 10th birthday was during my first term. So that was a prep school in Oxford. That school actually has a kind of Tibetan connection because Bazon Gould, who was one of the British officials in Lhasa, was from that school. And then I went to English, we say a public school, and then university. So in some respects, quite a conventional background for a certain kind of English person. I'm from that background. Having now lived abroad, I look at it with a certain amount of interested detachment, as well as, of course, I'm an insider to that world, as well as looking at it somewhat critically from the outside. But there are lots of things I value about it. In particular, I think I was given a very good academic training, which I value all the more. I studied history at A-level, history and languages, French and German. I think that I use every day, more or less every day, the skills that I acquired then. In particular, I remember this was exam-oriented, but nonetheless it was helpful. Every week we had to write, I think, 2 45-minute history essays, which was, as I say, good training. It was an academic training building on my existing interests, because I was always interested in history from as long as I can remember.
So that's why you decided then to study history at university?
Yes. In fact, I mean, it probably wasn't a very difficult choice, although just recently I was rereading a diary which I'd kept, and I see that I was complaining, lightly complaining, gently complaining, but my father had been talking to my teachers, discussing what subjects I should discuss. And it had then, I had actually forgotten this, but it had then occurred to me that I might want to study Oriental studies. I think I had mentioned Tibetan. My father thought the word he used was that this was fanciful. But actually my teacher, this was my language teacher, thought it wasn't such a bad idea. I didn't, in fact, follow up on that, but the history that I studied, you, of course, could choose, the whole idea was that you had to choose quite a broad range. But the topic, the paper which I most remember from Cambridge, it was then called, quote unquote, the expansion of Europe. I think it's now called, I'm not sure what it is called, but it was about the European engagement with the wider world from the 15th, 16th century, from maybe the 16th century. That was quite formative. I also studied African history before going to university. I'd spent 8 months in Kenya. Kenya specifically hasn't been particularly relevant to my subsequent work, but broadly it was relevant because it was a place outside Europe. So already at A-level, that's a school leaving exam, I'm interested in English history. Again, more in a way from living outside England, but always international history as well. That started by being European history, but then it became Asian, but also African history. What we then studied about Asia, I would say, was pretty introductory rather than deep or profound, but nonetheless it was a very useful and worthwhile introduction.
And how do you remember Kenya from that time? It must have been early 70s.
It was 75. So that was quite a privilege. At that time, so again, it was through a church organization. They had a scheme, it was called Youth Service Abroad. And at that time, school leavers, so I was actually only 17, there was a role which school leavers could play as teachers in rural secondary schools. So with another, in fact he was from my school, had been from my school. We spent 8 months teaching in a rural secondary school. In retrospect, I find it somewhat remarkable that we were thrown in, basically thrown into a classroom without any real training, definitely without any real training, with some superficial training. That was helpful, because when I subsequently went to India, straight from university, but nonetheless I already had some kind of experience, different circumstances, but the experience was something I could apply.
So how were the studies of history at Cambridge then?
Well, I mean, again, I guess it's a continuation of what I said about writing weekly essays. So, in this case, the basic format was we had lectures. The lectures were more or less optional. Nobody checked whether you went to them. Some people, in fact, didn't go to any of them. But I was quite dutiful. But the main vehicle for teaching was we had to write a weekly essay and the reading for the essay. Talking to people from other universities, I heard that sometimes they only wrote one essay a term. Well, we had one a week. That was useful. But then what happened? You had a supervision with either one or often two people. Actually, often only one person, with a reasonably senior academic. So to have an hour a week discussing what you'd written, that was a very strong and quite powerful education. We didn't do so much seminar work. It was basically one-to-one. I think, in retrospect, I think some seminar work would have been good too, but I'm happy with what we did do.
And who were your teachers, if I can ask? They wouldn't be particularly recognizable from a Tibetan studies field. So from history, there was one. I guess this is family history. This is also quite a certain type of Brit. I went to the same Cambridge college that my father had been to, and the director of studies in history was somebody who'd known my father 40 years earlier. His name was Rafe Bennett. He was a specialist of medieval history, but during the war he was a German speaker and writer. He'd been in Bletchley Park, which is quite famous as a decoding center intercepting German messages. So he retired soon after. Well, he retired after I left university, but soon after that. And having been a medieval historian, he developed a second career as a writer of Second World War intelligence, as an author in a study. So he was one. Another one from my college was somebody called Ronald Hyam. He was a historian of the British Empire. So I guess those two in particular. On Indian history, as a lecturer, I remember Anil Seal. He was a historian of the Congress Party, pre-independence Congress Party. Jack Gallagher, again, he was a well-known figure in the history of British Empire. None of these figures would really have, and they would have been interested in, but not really touching on Tibetan studies. Were the teachers influential on you somehow, apart from the standard curriculum you went through?
Yeah, I mean, yes, of course, but I would say that the standard curriculum wasn't exactly standard, so that was the special thing about Cambridge. It wasn't. It wasn't that there were certain things that you had to do. So you had to take a European paper. You had to take one paper before, I can't remember what the cutoff date was, but basically a medieval paper. I was happy to do that. But it wasn't standard in the way that you were reading from a textbook. You would discuss with your supervisor what you wanted to write about, and he would broadly agree. Another one I remember, this was in fact a one-on-one supervision in my final year. Jonathan Steinberg, who was a historian of modern Europe, quite well known, still, well, until recently, still writing.
So you did your bachelor studies at Cambridge, and what happened then?
So at Cambridge, I got to know Sespal Kundan. Sespal was my link with Ladakh, still is my link with Ladakh. He is a Ladakhi, he's a Ladakhi Christian. He was studying theology at Cambridge. I can't remember explicitly how the topic came up, but I remember in my final year at Cambridge, other people seemed to be doing quite conventional things like becoming accountants and bankers. I wasn't ready to become an accountant and banker. I wanted to do something else. I had already had the Kenyan experience, so I was looking for something similar. I did something broadly similar. I think I can't actually remember for certain whether I applied to something called VSO, Voluntary Service Overseas. I do remember that I applied to the Quakers, and they subsequently offered me a job in teaching history in Lebanon. Had I gone there, my life would have been rather different. But I was already in India, so couldn't take it. So somehow or other, talking to Sespal, the idea that it could come that I would teach at the school, which had been started by his grandfather. And his father, to some degree, was a kind of, well, I don't want to say family enterprise, but very closely associated with his family. So the idea came up that I should teach there. And so that's what I did. I actually stayed with his family, although he wasn't there. He was still studying by that time in America.
So you went to India to this school. And where was the school?
So the school is still there, of course. It's in Rajpur, which is then in Uttar Pradesh, now in Uttarakhand, and it's north of Dehradun, and on the way between Dehradun and Mussoorie. It's from Dehradun to Mussoorie. You go first up a gentle slope and then up a steep slope. It was the point more or less where the gentle slope meets the steep slope.
And so how was it, your experience there?
It was good. So and one thing I remember before going to India, my father had introduced me to a Baptist missionary who lived in India. I can't remember his name. I can't actually remember very much about him, but I can remember what he said. One thing he said that your time in India will be as important as Cambridge. I very much think that. So I never studied for a postgraduate qualification, but apart from a librarianship diploma, but I do regard it was 2 years and a few months. I regard those as being quite formative. So the school was mainly, in fact, exclusively a boarding school. At that time, as I say, mainly Tibetan. There were some Nepalis and maybe a few local children. Now the makeup's a bit different. Quite a small staff. There was a Tibetan monk from Ando, and in the mid-morning break we would drink tea together. We would sit together. To begin with, I didn't really have a language in common, but we somehow or other communicated. Later on I learned some Hindi, and he knew quite a bit of Hindi, so we communicated in that language. The children, actually I'm still in touch. In fact, I'm more in touch with some of them, partly because of social media, Facebook. So the school had quite a strong sense of community. I remember being quite struck how the older children looked after the younger children. The teaching, I had quite small classes. I had the same timetable every day, which was mainly class 7 and 8, but I had one class every day. with class 2. And what I was supposed to be teaching them was craft and games. That was most difficult because there were 25 of them. And again, to start with, we didn't really have a language in common, but somehow or other we survived.
So what kind of crafts and games you taught them?
Well, not much craft. I do remember making paper hats with a newspaper, but I got quite good at the games, and I discovered certain fairly basic things. One was that if you have the children in a ring holding hands, that was a good thing to do, because then if they were holding hands with each other, then they were less likely to run away. We did things like that, and there were songs which went with those games, which I suppose had some kind of educational content, because they were in English.
And you were probably starting to learn the language you spoke.
So I started learning Hindi, and my rather ambitious idea, which wasn't fulfilled, was that I would learn Hindi first and then Tibetan in year 2. I learned it informally, but somewhat effectively. There were these rather half-baked books, Learn Hindi in 3 weeks. It took rather longer than 3 weeks, but I did use those books, and I had friendly people to talk to. So I, at least for conversational purposes, over the 2 years, I got reasonably good meant, it actually meant that people thought that I was Anglo-Indian. That wasn't necessarily a compliment, because I found that Anglo-Indians, people from mixed ancestry, some of them spoke Hindi deliberately badly to show that they weren't Paka Indian. But anyway, so that did happen. That became useful, because when I went to Ladakh, I spoke Hindi, and then people said, you speak Urdu. Basically the same language, slightly different vocabulary. But that also meant when I was in Ladakh, I built on the Hindi Urdu rather than working on Ladakhi.
So when did you come to Ladakh for the first time?
So basically I was living with a Ladakhi family, but not in Ladakh. So I went in the summer of 1979 in the school holidays. The school holidays were from May until July. And I went first to Srinagar in Kashmir, then by road. At that point, the pass was still closed, the Sojila, but I got a bus to Sonamarg, which is on the Kashmir side of the pass. And they were in the process of clearing the pass, but they hadn't completed the process. But I was with another backpacker. We got a lift on an army truck to the top of the pass, and then we walked across the pass and got a lift on the other side. So they had in fact cleared a path. I'm not just a path, a track, but there wasn't much traffic, if any traffic. I think there must have been some traffic, but not regular traffic going through. So we walked across. That was actually quite a good. I'm glad I did that, because I experienced for myself what earlier generations of travellers had experienced. You go from Kashmir, which is at least superficially rather like Switzerland. You have all these pine forests, quite green, and the top of the pass was snow. I remember hearing cuckoo at the top of the pass, and then on the other side, I think it was raining lightly, so it was grey rather than green. A little bit later there would have been summer flowers, but a completely different landscape with no trees. So we walked a little way down the other side, then we got a lift with an army truck as far as Kargil, and then the following day went by bus to Leh. The bus broke down halfway, so it's a journey which takes all day anyway, but or did then. In fact, we only got to Ladakh well after dark, around 10 or 11 o'clock. So we spent the night staying at the house of some passenger we'd met on the bus. And then the following day I had various introductions of people to meet and people to stay with. So then I followed up one of the introductions.
And how do you remember Ladakh from that time?
Well, of course, quite vividly. So I was lucky because I did have these introductions, and I stayed with different people. I stayed first because there were church connections on the church compound. I also stayed at one of the guest houses, which was owned by the parents of one of my pupils. The guest house is still there, but it's expanded. Otsal Guest House in Transpar, and my pupil was Deskyong Namgyal, who's now, I saw him last year. He's the deputy principal of the local college. So I guess I remember it different then and the following year. So in that first year, what I did, I went to Hamis, I went up the valley opposite. I walked quite a lot because I like walking anyway. And then I came back. In fact, I walked from, that's maybe jumping ahead, but I met an American and we walked together. We were going to start in Lamayuru. We in fact started in Khalse. Through Zanskar to Lahul. So that was, at that point, that was the only way you could get to Zanskar. The road hadn't been built, so you had to walk. That was very memorable. So differences between then and now, many fewer vehicles. I remember thinking of it as a kind of joke that at the entrance to the bazaar there was a little island on which a policeman could stand to direct the traffic, and that was a joke because there was no traffic, hardly any traffic. Basically people walked. And another thing, this was, I can sort of date it more or less precisely in my experience. I revisited Ladakh in 1983. Well, we'll come on to that. In 1980, I spent most of the year. In 1983, 1986, I can't remember. There might have been a bit of a gap, but anyway, I remember visiting in the early 90s, and there was quite a distinct difference, which is that lots of walls everywhere. So when I was there, people didn't have walls around their houses, which I think is symbolic. In lots of ways, it was more socially open than it subsequently became. So there's a difference in appearance, but there's also some social factors behind that difference. So what were the social changes you would say that have influenced this or triggered this? Well, again, it's jumping ahead a bit, but in 1989, there were some quite painful political developments. Basically, there was some disturbances in the bazaar. There was a Buddhist-led boycott of Muslims. So there was a political movement which increased. It was a divisive political movement which divided communities in a way that hadn't been true before. Certainly hadn't been true to that degree. So still in 1979. For how long did you stay, and did you develop some friendships? Did you somehow became a part of the place? It has influenced you until now, to stay in Ladakh, I suppose. Yes, so more the following year, but already even before getting there, I already had these contacts through my students and through Tesma's family. So, in fact, there were already people that I knew, and I got to know them better in the following year. So what happened was, in 1989, the Christian community, they talked about that starting a school. So there had been a school there before, and they had the idea that they were going to start a mission school. Well, they didn't know what they were going to call it. They were going to start a school. So they asked me then, did I want to come and teach at the school? And I guess I expressed interest, although I was a little bit skeptical, because the plans for the school didn't sound very thorough, very convincing. So I then went back to Rushmore in July, and I stayed until September. So that completed a year. I could have stayed longer, but I wanted to see a bit more of India, and my idea at the time was Rushmore was good, but because it was a boarding school, it felt a little bit like an island, and I wanted to see a bit more. So what initially happened was I went to Madhya Pradesh, and again, through an introduction, I stayed with a Methodist American missionary. And then I went for another further 2.5 months, I guess. I went back to Rajpur for Christmas, and then I went for a further 2.5 months traveling to southern India. So in the meantime, I was corresponding with Ladakh, and were they serious about the school? And they said yes, they were serious. Come. So in March 1980, I did. I travelled via Rajpur and again via Kashmir. I was in Kashmir in March. I remember it as being very cold. It wasn't snowy, but it was wet, rather like the kind of West British winter. The pass was closed, so we flew to Ladakh. That was the first time I had flown to Ladakh. The flight was cancelled. I remember a particular phrase was imprinted on my mind going to the airport and being told, flight cancel ho gaya, the flight has been cancelled. And so going to and fro 5 times, but then on the 6th time or the 5th time, the flight wasn't cancelled, and we went to Ladakh. So yes, I arrived in Ladakh in March 1980. Lots of things I remember from that period quite vividly. Because it was March, there was nothing green in the whole country. The only green things were green jerry cans, which people used to get water, second-hand army green camouflage jackets, which you could buy in the bazaar. But it was the end of the winter. There wasn't a lot of snow. Maybe there was a certain amount of snow. The road was closed, so there weren't very many vegetables in the bazaar. The main food one had was rice, Indian subsidized rice, kidney beans, spinach, sometimes meat. It wasn't very cold, but quite cold, different from what it had been in the summer. So I arrived with another teacher from India who had met in Srinagar. I'm saying India, Ladakh is part of India, of course, but especially then people, when they went to Delhi, they would say, we are going to India. So it's not that they would deny that Ladakh was a part of India. They weren't separatist, but nonetheless, they had this idea that India was somewhere else. So the school, there was ostensibly a committee, but the person who was leading the committee was somebody called Nathaniel Bhattacharya. We two, John Prasad, the teacher, he's from Madras, and we stayed at his house, and we made plans for the opening of the school. In retrospect, I would almost say that we were irresponsible, because basically there were no plans, and we got there. We had 2 or 3 weeks. The date of the opening kept being put back for a week. there were some rooms on what was still known as the mission compound. There was at first no furniture, so the children sat on the floor. That wasn't a great hardship, but nonetheless. There weren't any textbooks, but we ordered some textbooks, and over the course of the following few weeks they arrived. We were the first two teachers. We decided between us that John Prasad would be the principal, and it wasn't my idea, but I was given the title of superintendent. And that meant that I kept the accounts, so I've never been particularly an accountant, but anyway, I did keep the accounts as well as teaching a full timetable. We also recruited other teachers. The first one was a Mrs. Mahanti, who was from Orissa. She was the wife of the SP, Superintendent of Police. Another one was called Tsering Dhundup Gonkatsang. She was a Tibetan, had been trained as a nurse. We were the first four. Afterwards, as the school expanded, we recruited others. So, as I say, we were almost irresponsible because we basically weren't prepared at all, but we became prepared. And we needed very little by way of advertising because Christian schools had a good reputation, and I would almost say an undeservedly good reputation. Already at that time, many Ladakhis were sending their children to school elsewhere in India, in Chandigarh or Dalhousie for some reason, maybe Jammu. And many of those schools were church schools. So I remember somebody telling us, we're so glad that you are starting a convent school. I didn't really think of myself as starting a convent school, but nonetheless I could see what they meant. So it wasn't very difficult to recruit children. In fact, more the problem was we quickly had more applicants than we had space. The children came from all the communities, Christian, Buddhist, Muslim. Probably more of them came from the Islamia school, which perhaps at that time was going through a difficult period. We started with classes 1 and 2. In the course of the year, we added a class 3 and also upper and lower KG. KG stands for kindergarten. So that was my main activity over that year. I remember the year quite vividly. In fact, I had 2 jobs because I was teaching and I was running the accounts. One of the members of the congregation taught me double entry bookkeeping, which I've since forgotten how to do by hand. Also at that time, the pastor, he went on a trip to Europe and he left me in charge of church services. That was a little bit strange, but actually not completely strange. It wasn't because I was particularly holy at all. It was because I was a more or less neutral outsider. So the 2 people who should have been taking church services, the congregation, slightly split. So I was a neutral person who had made no enemies. So I was given that job. And then also relevant, in fact, in retrospect, highly relevant to what I subsequently done, I did then start what became one of my areas of research. There was still a mission library which contained printed books. It contained some pamphlets printed in Ladakh, in Tibetan and in Urdu. And it also contained some German mission magazines. It was Missionsblatt from the Brüdergemeinde. Brüdergemeinde is the German for the Moravian Church. So that was something else for which my education had equipped me. I had studied German. I could read the Missionsblad, nobody else could, but I could. They had a run from 1883 to the First World War, 1914, and they also had a couple of books also written in German about the history of the mission. So one was written in the 1880s, one from the 1890s. So in situ, on site, so to speak, I started reading these history, those letters from the missionaries. For publication purposes, they were somewhat censored, but nonetheless they went into quite a lot of, in fact, often quite frank detail. The missionaries talking about their frustrations with the local congregation. So I started reading those. I've just recently been rereading my own letters home, and I found myself saying that I actually quite quickly learned more about the history of the church than people there knew. That's actually still true. I know things, they know things that I don't know, and I know things that they don't know. So already during that period, I remember writing a kind of summary of the history. The pastor, as I say, went to Germany, and he did go to Germany. He went to Germany and England for 3 weeks. I wrote a kind of essay for him to supplement his own knowledge, which was also quite important. Also during that period, I got to know quite a network of people. When some of them have now passed away, others I'm still in touch. Among the people who passed away from my, I guess I could say from my parents' generation, so I particularly remember Eliza Jordan, after whom the degree college is named. He was born in the same year as my father, 1916. He also passed away in the same year as my father. I guess I thought of him as a kind of Ladakhi uncle. He was very supportive, gentle, interested in many of the same things that I was interested in. Another from more or less the same generation, a bit younger, was Captain Dana. Captain was because he had actually been in the British Army, British Indian Army during the war. He'd been in Iraq, subsequently in the Indian Army. So those people were great supporters. I guess those two, and others. There was a younger person, Rigson Wangtak. He wanted to learn English from me. We didn't actually study English at all formally, but we did meet quite often in the evenings, and we would discuss this and that. I dare say his English improved, but I learned quite a lot of Ladakh from him. He was working as a clerk in the government handicraft centre, but he was also more than interested. He had some specialist knowledge in Ladakhi medicine, Amchi medicine. So I learned a lot of things from him. So in all sorts of ways, that year was a great privilege. When I went to India, it had been clear that I wanted to be a participant. I didn't just want to be a backpacker, which is why I was happy to be teaching at a school. That was even more true in lay. I mean, in my capacity as a teacher at a school, I guess I was a figure in local society. I was, at least definitely a participant. I would maybe hesitate to say I was an insider, but definitely a participant.
And what did you teach at the school?
So one of the points of the school was that it was meant to be English medium. So I did teach English. I also taught these, so again, some of the things I'd learnt in Rochborough, getting the children to hold hands instead of running away. again came in useful there. So I think basically English. In Rajpur I'd also taught history, but that wasn't relevant there. Children, again thinking about it in retrospect, most of them started by not knowing any English. Maybe a little bit. By that time, I did have enough basic Urdu to explain things. I should say basic Urdu. It wouldn't. I passed a test in grammatical accuracy, but I was able to make myself understood to them. But they learnt really quickly. Again, in retrospect, they also didn't, many of them, know the Roman alphabet. One child, I remember, his training until then, he was in class 2, he'd been taught how to write in Urdu, so he wrote from right to left instead of left to right, and I remember him writing the Roman alphabet right to left, but anyway, he learned how to write it in the right direction quite quickly. So that's what I was teaching.
So how many students were there?
So I was mainly teaching the older children, but the older children were not very old. It was class 2 and 3. So in class 2 there were maybe 25, and in class 3 was rather small at 10 or 11. And I've recently been reading my letters, as I say, to my parents. I found myself saying that I had been teaching the KG, but now the teacher was sufficiently strong that I could leave her on her own, which makes me sound as though I was very experienced, which of course I wasn't, but at least I had some experience. But I would just say mainly class 2 or 3. Some of those people I've recently got back in touch with them. I've been in Ladakh on and off, keep meeting them, hearing about them.
And how did the school then develop? So you established it. You spent some years there, some time there.
No, so and the school, so it really developed quite quickly. As I say, in retrospect, remarkably quickly, and it wasn't particularly because of our efforts. It was because of the good name of Christian schools elsewhere in India, church schools elsewhere in India, and it was because there was a demand for it. So I was basically there for a year. I had a ticket back to Europe. So the arrangement with the first school in Rajpur was that I was officially a volunteer. I was given pocket money of 100 rupees a month, which at that time was a lot more money than it sounds now. But I was also given a ticket back to Europe, which was paid for by one of the German sponsors. So I had this ticket, which had an expiry date, it had a deadline. Anyway, I thought I wanted to go back to see my parents. So at the end of that year, in 1988, anyway, went back to Europe. The question then was whether I should come back to India after that. I decided not to. It was I still remember it as a difficult decision. Because I really felt quite torn. The rational reasons, there was a little bit of head over heart. The rational reasons for not going were, one, that I wasn't going to spend my whole life in India. I already thought that I was quite old. I was 24. So I didn't actually know what I was going to do, but I thought it was time to find out. I didn't know what I was going to do in England. The other reasons were there was one other English teacher who would come in the summer and had offered her services. So, and then there were two more, in fact, friends of one of my brothers who had written to ask whether they could come. Nathaniel Bhattapur had the organizer of the school, of the board, had the idea that the more the merrier, which actually wasn't my own idea, but I wasn't the decision maker. So I felt maybe there were at least enough, or maybe too many English people already at the school. I actually think that was correct, although only partly correct, because, of course, as I say, I did know things. By that time, goodness me, I was only 24 and I had only been in India for 2.5 years, but nonetheless, I was somewhat experienced, and I knew about the school, I knew what went wrong, and I was beginning to learn what worked. So had I gone back, I would certainly have had a role to play, but nonetheless I felt on balance that it was time to find out what to do next. The decision was vindicated because in March or April, the English people who were there was another friend of mine from another school, they all got official letters saying they weren't allowed to teach in Ladakh because it was a sensitive border area. So you could be a tourist, you could even stay there unpaid, but you weren't allowed to work. Apparently there was a letter addressed to me, it had my name on it, but I wasn't there to receive it. So, as I say, in a way that was a vindication of the decision not to go back. Even now, I think of it as in some ways an obvious decision, but in other ways quite a difficult decision. So the school did develop. It's now one of the largest schools. It's of course had ups and downs, but it had now, say we started KG, kindergarten, to class 3. It now has the full range up to, I suppose, class 12. I think it must be class 12. And some quite distinguished former pupils. I read recently an interview with somebody who's in the Indian diplomatic service who's from that school. So I feel quite an honour to have been there at the beginning, and to some degree I guess I'm part of Ladakhi history. There are of course questions which we thought about at the time, about the strengths and weaknesses of English medium, about whether Ladakhi history is taught. I mean, all these sorts of questions, but it fulfilled there was definitely a demand for it, and so I think, on balance, it made a positive contribution.
So what happened then? You returned to the UK?
So I returned to the UK, and I remember that as being quite a difficult period, but quite common to other people, reverse culture shock. At that time, my father had just retired, and I remember him talking about the experience of retiring, that you had been somebody who had a role and who was a local personality, and now you were nothing. Well, actually, I felt the same thing, and because I had been a local personality in Leh, a rather small society, de facto I was somebody who people recognised in the bazaar. Who is this person? And now I wasn't sure what to do. I had acquired skills which were no use whatever in England. How to do things, how to speak to people, how to buy vegetables in the bazaar without being cheated or without being cheated too much. I mean all these things which were of no use at all in England. So I had the idea that I had studied history, that was good, but I thought I needed some kind of professional skill. I also thought I had enjoyed teaching, but I didn't want to teach in an English school. So I did study for a qualification. In fact, I studied for a librarianship qualification. And my idea was that was education, but it was not teaching, somewhat related and could be useful. That year was actually quite a good year. I think of it as a kind of rehabilitation because I was in a college in Wales. Even though I never became a librarian, I guess some of those skills were somewhat useful. In relation to Ladakh, there was one quite specific thing that came out of it, which was that as part of the course we had to prepare a bibliography. And I prepared a bibliography of Ladakh, which I then subsequently expanded, and it was published as a book-length bibliography. And in fact, I'm still... The first one came out in 1988, excuse me, not 38, but 30 years ago. 30 years ago. It's time for a new edition. I'm still adding to it. So what then happened, so I did that year, and then I started applying for jobs. I eventually got a job not as a librarian, but in fact with the company I'm still working for after all this time, as a researcher in political risk, so for the private sector. That side of my life is still an important part of my life. It gives me a living. Also means that I'm engaged with the contemporary world. I travel quite a bit, and some of what I do I hope is somewhat useful. The fields in which I work are anti-corruption and business and human rights. I hope that makes some kind of contribution. But in parallel, I've kept up my engagement with Ladakh and the wider region. So the way that happened, while I was studying my librarianship, I got an invitation to a conference. The conference had the title Recent Research on Ladakh. It was in Constance in West Germany. There was West Germany then. So I was invited. I couldn't go because it was term time and I was a diligent student and I didn't think one could go. In retrospect, I should have asked and gone, but then, anyway, I didn't go. But I did send them a paper. I had already been studying the mission magazines. In fact, when I had come back to England and I had nothing better to do, I was looking around trying to work out what next to do, I wrote that up into a longer history. Longer means, I don't know, 10,000 words, 15,000 words. And so I sent part of that as a paper, and they accepted it for publication. So that was a great encouragement. At that time, it was, of course, exciting to have anything at all published. Subsequently, or in fact in parallel, I sent an article to Tibet Journal. That was about Heinrich August Jeschke, who was a Moravian missionary, who was a linguist. His death anniversary was he died in 1883, so his anniversary was 1983. So I used that as an excuse, and they published that too. So conferences have been, what I say is that conferences have been my postgraduate university, so being 2 years in India was my postgraduate study. But then I haven't been attached to any university, but the conferences have been my quasi-university. deadlines. I find it quite difficult to write things without deadlines. Deadlines do motivate you. The possibility of publication also motivates you. And so I have been part of various overlapping communities. What happened as regards Ladakh studies was that the first conference, as I say, was in 1981. And then there was another conference in 1985, and I did go to that one. That was in Pau, in southern France. Again, I sent them a paper. And the third conference was in Herrnhut in southeast Germany, southeast of East Germany, which still existed, the German Democratic Republic. The significance of Herrnhut is that it's the historical headquarters of the Moravian Church, who had sent these missionaries to Ladakh. In German, the church is known as the Herrnhuter Brüdergemeine, Herrnhut Unity of Brethren. So the third conference in Ladakh took place there, and that conference was memorable because it involved going to East Germany and travelling through the checkpoint in Friedrichstraße in Berlin. It was a taste of the DDR, a taste of East Germany. The further significance was that at that conference we collectively decided to set up an international association for Ladakh studies. The particular source of inspiration was somebody called Henry Osmaston. He'd been lots of things. He'd been a forester in Uganda. He subsequently studied for a PhD in Oxford, and he became a lecturer in geography at Bristol University. So he had been involved in similar associations. He appointed himself the Home Secretary. There was an international advisory committee, and I became part of that. And then when Henry wanted to step down from being a secretary, I became secretary, he became president. When he passed away, I later became president between 2007 and 2015. So that's been quite important. The flavour of the IATS, International Association for Ladakh Studies, is different from, maybe complementary to, International Association of Tibet Studies. Ladakh, of course, is different. Ladakh is next to Tibet, lots of links with Tibet, but it's not Tibet. It has its own character. The group of scholars is smaller, but it's still quite broad in lots of ways, internationally quite broad. A range of disciplines, so we've been wider than Tibetan studies in that we haven't had many natural scientist types and people interested in climate. We've had some, but certainly geographers, anthropologists, of course, historians, of course, quite a strong, active history of art group. I think we have rather an impressive record in that we've had conferences every 2 years, pretty well without a break. There was a bit of a break. I mentioned earlier, 1989 had been a difficult year for Ladakh. We had a conference in Bristol in 1989. The next one was supposed to be in Leh. That was postponed. We had one in London in, I think, 1991. Or might have been 1992, and then we did go to Leh in 1993, and since then it has been every 2 years, either in Ladakh or in Europe. So that's been a very important part of my life. I have also been part of Tibetan Studies, IATS. The way that came about, in fact, it came about because of the bibliography. So in compiling the bibliography, I was scouring libraries, journals, but also writing to people. One of the people I wrote to was Helga Ubach, based in Munich, and she was then the secretary of the IATS. And she said, why don't I offer a paper to the IATS? So I did that. The first IATS conference I went to was in Narita in Japan in 1989. That was really impressive, September 1989. It was the first time I'd been to Japan. The conference itself, it was organized by the Narita Institute of Buddhist Studies. I had, before going there, I imagined it was going to be in some kind of monastic center. It actually wasn't. It was in an airport hotel. But nonetheless, what was really impressive about it was the sheer numbers of people. I think subsequent conferences have been bigger, quite a bit bigger actually. I don't know how many of these were, maybe 200, maybe 300. But people from all over the place. I got to know some Russians, for example. So I gave a paper on Moravians, in fact, in Kenora, again, that was published. That was encouraging. That conference played another part of my life, because it was through that conference that I met my wife, who is from Japan. She was then studying in England, and she was a friend of one of my sisters-in-law, who suggested that my wife Miyoko might be the person to give me advice on what to do in Japan. And so I met her. I can tell you where I met her, because that also, I guess, is reflective a bit of how I spent my time. So I quite often spent Saturday mornings in the library of SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies, so mornings and afternoons, in fact. Part of my parallel life as a Ladakh researcher, so I met her there on a Saturday afternoon. That we didn't get married until quite a long time after that, but that was how it started. And that also, so directly, going to Japan was a consequence of Tibetan studies. It was also, in some ways, a diversion from Tibetan studies, but not completely, because right the way through, I've kept up this connection.
So back to the Ladakhi International Association, how many people started it? Then how did you see the development of the association until now?
I guess we too have evolved, and there's a constant question about how we should be reinventing it. So, and I should further say that I've stepped back a bit, although I'm still part of it. So it's keen that other people should be playing their role in the reinventing. Of course, to start with, it was quite small, but maybe not that small. I'm trying to remember how many people were in Hermit. Maybe actually quite small, maybe 30. And slightly larger in Bristol. I remember I discussed this quite recently. I think I always felt that in some ways it was an advantage that you couldn't make your living out of Ladakh studies. You had to be something else. In Henry's case, he was a geography teacher. In my case, I earned my living in something quite different. And my take on that is that it meant that we had, on one hand, we had quite a focused set of interests, but we couldn't afford to be too narrow in the way we lived our lives, and so it was an interesting bunch of people. So what I think has always been good, as I say, about Ladakh studies is the diversity of people. Diversity of people means different disciplines, but it also means different nationalities, and it also means Ladakhi themselves. We've, I guess, been fortunate compared to Tibetan studies for obvious reasons, understandable reasons. There's never been an IATS conference in Tibet, whereas we've often had Ladakh conferences in Ladakh, and therefore we've had Ladakhi participation. We've worked quite hard and are continuing to work quite hard to encourage younger Ladakhis to participate. I've worked quite hard in editing their texts for publication. One thing that we're seeing now is that there are a new, I can almost say generations, plural, of younger Ladakhis who are studying at a postgraduate level in a variety of Indian but even international universities. They vary, of course. In my particular topic in historical research, many of the younger Ladakhis have been through English language education, English medium, and therefore are not good at reading historical sources in Tibetan. But there are one or two of those as well. There's one that I'm in touch with. He's now in Hong Kong. He's had a monastic education, as he says himself. He's spent his entire life studying Tibetan texts. He's now studying Tibetan language historical texts on Ladakh, and I think that's great. So, of course, well, not of course, but quality is often a little bit uneven, but overall it's improving. One other aspect, this is important. In Ladakh there are two main towns. There's Leh, the historical capital of the Kingdom of Ladakh. There's also Kargil, which is Muslim majority. Our most recent conference in Ladakh was in Kargil. That was the second conference. The actually most recent one last year was in Poland. And for myself, I quite like the combination of Europe and Ladakh, although one thing to say there is that visas are an increasing problem, in fact they're a real pain, which makes it much more difficult to organise international conferences these days with non-European participants.
And since you've been also observing and taking part in the International Association of Tibetan Studies meetings, how have you perceived its changes and its development?
Okay, so I've been a faithful participant in IATS, not so faithful in and there have been practical reasons I haven't always been able to go to IATS. The last one I went to was in Mongolia. That again, it was wonderful to have a reason to go to Ulaanbaatar. I also had a homestay, which meant a stay in a ger, a Mongolian tent in the countryside. So that was wonderful. I do value those large conferences, both because they're large and in spite of the fact that they're large. So, I mean, it's frustrating going to lots of not being able to be in 2 or 3 places at once, but they often lead on to really valuable contacts who remain contacts. In fact, I mean, quite specifically, that particular conference, we are here, I'm having this interview in Bonn. I'm here for a workshop which is in a series. It was social history in Tibetan societies. It's now social status in Tibetan societies. I've now been to a series of these workshops and contributed to their publications, but the first one that I went to was a direct result of the Ulaanbaatar conference. So I value both types of conferences. I guess I really prefer the smaller ones because you get to know people better, in a way less stressful. But I do think there's value in having a overall interdisciplinary meeting place.
And you've also moved to Japan for some time. How was your life in Japan?
Yeah, okay, so I'm not sure how relevant that is to the main topic, but of course it's a key part of my life. So I was in Japan for 12 years. My wife is Japanese. I'm a modern husband because we moved because of her job, not because of mine. Japan is an adventure. It's sometimes quite difficult as an outsider. So what would I say in relation to this topic? There's a group of Japanese scholars working on Ladakh, and well, yes, a few working on Ladakh, not very many, rather more on Tibet. The ones I know best are first an anthropologist who originally worked in Nepal, very helpful in introducing me to other people, and now more recently a younger historian who's interested in many of the common things. For me, though, I'm working as an independent scholar, which is what I have been doing. Japan made things more difficult rather than easier because I'm further away from libraries and archives. Having said that, well, there are two things. One is that it's much easier than it used to be able to get sources electronically. The other way of coping it is that when I do come to a place where there's archives, I have these rather intense visits. These days one takes pictures with iPad, and so I take lots of pictures and then study them later. I guess also there is some, in Japan, Asia is very diverse. In fact, it's more diverse than Europe. Nonetheless, viewing Tibet from Japan, well, one does see some things in common. One thing that particularly struck me, I remember having a kind of sense of recognition in Ladakh when traditional Ladakhi kitchens, there is a hierarchical order in the way that people sit. The senior person sits in front of the hearth, has a higher table, and then there's a slightly lower table for the next most senior person. And I remember I was doing a training event in Japan with people back from two government agencies, and I noticed they were in fact sitting in the same way in rank order on opposite sides of the table. So I thought, that's just like Ladakh. I'm sure there are also not exactly historical parallels, but latterly in Japan, we lived in the south of Japan in a place called Kumamoto, which is famous for its castle, which was built in the early 17th century. While we were there, I was also with colleagues writing about Ladakhi castles built in the same period. I guess in my own mental world map, I've been thinking about what has been going on in three different places. So Ladakh and Tibet, regions I should say, rather than places, Ladakh and Tibet, Japan, and also Europe. So those kinds of comparisons, it's quite hard to put one's finger on something that I can put in a paper and say this is a brilliant insight that I've got because of this experience, but nonetheless it does influence my perspective on the world.
So what have you found so fascinating being between Europe and Asia? In fact, and you like to follow these questions in your research as well, these cultural interactions.
Okay. So I guess there are a couple of things. I think of myself as having been a little bit pragmatic in what I've studied. So I have studied the things which were accessible to me. So there was a very obvious example, which was because the gift of the earlier education that I had, because I had German reading skills, these German sources were open to me, same French sources, because I've also been using French archival sources and missions étrangères and also government sources. So there's a little bit of pragmatism is that these sources are open to me without an enormous amount of effort. And there's plenty which is of interest. I guess, I mean, the way I express it to myself is that the work I do is a pure art form. Pure in the sense that it doesn't actually have to be utilitarian, despite what government research funding agencies want it to be. That learning about these interactions, just following the story. So one of the motivation is following the story. You follow the story about individual lives. You want to know what happens next, but you want to know why it happens. So one thing that I would say is I've been studying an area which is quite a long way from the area in which I was born. But in doing so, it also sheds light on my own region in two ways. One is because there are direct connections between what has been happening in Europe and what has been happening in Asia. I guess the other thing is the difference. So in the things that I've been studying, there have been several, I guess, overlapping themes. One is that quite a lot of what I've written has been about individuals, and so I'm interested in individual lives. Some of that is also pragmatic as part of what I can realistically do for a conference paper. So the strategy has been to write about the individual and then to say something about the wider context and what their lives say about the wider context. But I'm also interested in the bigger themes. So the history of Christianity in different sectors, it's an obvious thing for me, having been brought up in a Christian home, but with an international view. So that I guess that is how I would still define myself. I'm quite rooted is the operative word in the country in which I'm born. But I have a broader perspective, and that broader perspective helps me to look at the culture in which I was born in a new way, sometimes critical way, sometimes it gives me insights that I otherwise wouldn't have had. So in answer, what is fascinating is the personal stories, but it is also the bigger picture. One story which has meaning for me, quite a personal story. So I have from time to time asked myself, does it make sense? So I've asked myself, does it make sense to be studying this distant culture? Why didn't I look at things which are closer to home and easier? Well, one answer is that I do. For example, in one of the people I've been, as a particular missionary called Albert Herman Franco, who's also a scholar, I wrote a paper about his experiences in the First World War and his experience after the First World War. Well, that's European history as well as Asian history. For that matter, the activities of East India Company in India are likewise European history as well as Asian history. It's both of them to combine. So that combination appeals. Quite late in my research, I came across a meaningful personal coincidence. And I should take you back to my original contact with Ladakh was through my friend Tsering Dhundup, who was from I can say a Christian dynasty. His grandfather founded the school that I taught in. His grandmother, wife of the founder of the school, co-founder of the school, is Tsering Dhundup. Her father was Joseph Gagan, who is well known as a historian of Ladakh and also as a Bible translator. So he's the kind of person who especially interests me. He was an original thinker. He was quite deeply rooted in, quite learned in, Ladakhi and Tibetan country. He thought of Ladakh as being part of the Tibetan world. But he was also a Christian, so what's going on there? And there's a lot more to find out than I have found out. There is scope for probably somebody else to do a closer study of what he'd been writing. So in fact, I wrote about him for the second IATS, Tibetan Studies Conference I went to, which was in Norway. In 2011, I went back to the Moravian archives in London, which I'd studied years earlier, and I reread some of the letters that I had read years earlier. And this time I noticed something which I hadn't noticed the first time. He refers to a nice English lady who's been writing to him and sending him books. So he's writing to a Moravian minister, a bishop in London. He's saying, this lady's been sending me these nice books. I appreciate it. What can I do to thank her? The name of this lady was Mrs. A.U.M. Dick, the initials A.U.M. and then Dick. Dick is my mother's maiden name, and this is my great-grandmother. So it means that Tsespas, my friend Tsespas' great-grandfather, was writing to my great-grandmother in the 1920s.
Oh, that's something.
Before we were born. So that certainly seems like a meaningful coincidence. I mean, from my point of view, it's not necessary in the sense that you don't need a justification for studying these things, but it is a kind of confirmation that I'm also studying my own history, or my own family's history in a way.
Oh, that's really something. So you said that personal stories are important, and why do you think they are important? Why do you like to trace history through people?
Okay, so yeah, okay. Sorry, I'm hesitating about where to start. So, I mean, again, I mean, my starting point isn't a profound theoretical reason. It's because I'm interested in individuals, and I guess if you want to start being somewhat more theoretical, all history is about the history of individuals. It's a history of millions of individuals, but you start with somebody. I have a potential project now. I don't know whether it will actually happen, but I'm wondering about whether to create a longer publication which would bring some of these biographies together. So I've been actively been thinking about it, and one of the people I've been thinking about, again, another person, an influential person in my life who I much respected in London. This is a bit of a digression, but let me explain. In London, I continued studying Urdu informally with a great Urdu teacher whose name was Ralph Russell. He loved teaching, so long after he retired, he had an arrangement whereby a group of 2 or 3 of us would meet on Wednesday evenings, and we would speak Urdu for an hour, and then we would drink beer for an hour. And in the course of it, I learned a lot about his life history. He was a lifelong 1930s communist, out of principle. So he wrote 2 volumes of autobiography, and in the beginning of the first volume, he explains, why am I doing this? So the way he expresses it is saying, some people say that only famous people should write their autobiographies or should have biographies. But I think, Ralph thinks, I think that every human being is valuable, and that includes me, includes Ralph. So here's my story. I think that too, and some of the people I write about are moderately famous in Tibetan studies circles. Some of them are not particularly famous, but I guess it's a value statement on my part. I think it's meaningful as well as intrinsically interesting to draw out these people's lives, to share them with their successors. I guess if one does want to be a little bit more theoretical, and there are current discussions about microhistory as an insight into larger patterns. So one could say that, but for me that comes second to the intrinsic interest of the topic. I do think the broader perspective is interesting too. So I mean, another long-term project will be to write a broader comparative history about the different Christian missions, and that relates to much wider questions about how world cultures interact with each other, what they have in common, what the differences are. In relation to Buddhism and Christianity, my own contribution, I think I do have a contribution. It's not so much philosophical or theological, it's more social and historical, about the things which have got in the way of meaningful contact, as well as the things which have contributed to meaningful contact.
So is this idea of every individual and every individual story having a value somehow connected to your work on human rights?
Yes. Since you're asking a direct question, then the direct answer is yes. Mm-hmm. Although I myself wouldn't necessarily draw that connection, but I guess I was discussing recently with one of my elder brothers about what it means to be brought up in a vicarage with your father as a priest, and there are advantages and disadvantages. One slight disadvantage is that at the local level you're a kind of public personality, which isn't, sometimes it's a bit tiresome. I was also saying that sometimes at school and even afterwards at school it was annoying to share that particular part of one's family background, because people made assumptions about you. They would expect you to be more virtuous or less virtuous, but that was a bit annoying. I wanted people to take me as I was rather than come to particular conclusions. And then I guess I'm repeating or sharing a thought process, but I didn't want people to think that I was interested in human rights because of that, or I was interested in Christian missions because of that. But actually, continuing the dialogue with myself, I shouldn't be annoyed, because it is so that particular background has influenced, I think the way I would put it, influenced the questions I ask. So it is questioning. It's exploring the way I would phrase it is the questions that I've been given, not so much the answers that I've been given. It's the questions that I've been given. Being given is also a phrase that springs to mind. I think I'm conscious of the gifts. Gift of education is certainly one of them. Writing those history essays, the language skills that I acquired from other people, the opportunities. So those opportunities, I'm trying to make something of those opportunities. And where I am now, so I've passed 60, I'm looking both forward and back, but in both sides of my life, I'm trying to think how to consolidate, draw connections, bring things together into something larger. That I guess relates to another topic, which is of being an independent researcher as distinct from working in a university. In some ways, I was going to say I was doing things in a wrong order, or correct wrong. I'm not doing things in the wrong order, but anyway, a different order. If you go through a former academic path, you write a long thesis and then perhaps you write a book and then you write another book. In my case, I've been writing a series of short articles because that's what I could do. Cumulatively, the articles amount to I think, reasonably significant body of work, but still there are gaps, and I would like to fill those gaps to create one or two, or actually two or three more substantial contributions. So, yes, I understand this to be part of the point of the interviews about where you come from and where and why. So I'm a historian. I'm fairly clear in my own mind about where I come from, and I'm constantly questioning where I come from and why. I don't think it's a bad place to come from. I think it's actually quite a good starting point, but as a starting point, the path, the questions continue.
And you probably enjoy being an independent researcher, the freedom. What would be
okay, so it has pluses and minuses. Again, I'm using the word pragmatic. In my own perception, it's been a response to circumstances, but also, of course, it's been the sum of lots of individual choices which has led to it. So I'm very aware that there are trade-offs. So let's start with the plus points. Plus points is that I can write for who I want, when I want. I do think it's important to write for different audiences. So right now I'm quite glad to be writing every now and then for a magazine published in Ladakh. I think we should be doing that. I think we should be writing blogs. I'm not writing Ladakhi blogs, but I'm in the anti-corruption world writing on corruption blogs. To appeal to a wider audience, I think that's important. My summary on my work as a historian versus my work as a consultant, I think I'm a better historian because I have other experience. I'm not a better consultant because I'm not as single-minded as perhaps I could have been if I wanted to make that my sole ambition in life. I am a better consultant because I have a broad perspective. Some people value that, some people don't, but that's up to them. I think it's an advantage. Another elder in my life, senior academic, but in a different field, anti-corruption field. He had been a professional academic, and then he became a government civil servant, eventually a high commissioner and ambassador. I asked him whether he regretted leaving the academic world. And he used an interesting phrase which sticks with me, that he appreciated both the cooperation and the competition which came from the academic world. On my side, there hasn't been that much competition, partly because my interests touch on other people's interests, but there aren't so many people working on those areas. But there's also not competing for rare jobs or status, so that's an advantage. I don't threaten anyone. On the other hand, I am part of various communities, and I do appreciate that. I think of the editing work I do. When I'm in a bad mood, I think of it as corvée labor, but when I am in a better mood, I think of it as community work, as a community contribution. Maybe disadvantages too. So if I'd done it full time, the single biggest difference is that I would have worked harder on language. But there's a solution to that too. The solution is that I need to work cooperatively with other colleagues, which I do anyway. As far as language, but other things too, the late Tsering Dhundup Gonkatsang was very important. But I have other collaborations right now. Two of the things that I'm working on, actually quite different. One is about floods, and I'm working with a geographer, and one is about textbooks. I was working with Tsering, but I'm anyway working with a third colleague on that. That's quite a long answer. The short answer is there are trade-offs, costs and benefits, but overall I consider myself very much overall fortunate.
Could I ask you, where did you learn Tibetan as a written language? With Tsering, or you just picked it up somehow? Because you can read Tibetan.
No, not very well. So I mean, as I say, that's the biggest gap, and there's a significant gap. When I was in India, I mentioned my sweeping ambition was that I would learn Hindi one year and then Tibetan the next. It didn't quite work out. There was plenty of Hindi to study even more. So in London, yes, I did study. In fact, the first somebody called James Lowe, who he has a Lopam degree from Shantiniketan, but has also studied some kind of psychotherapy. He was teaching a Tibetan class at the Working Men's College, which was a kind of rather strange combination. So I went to those classes for at least 1 year, maybe 2 years. And then, yes, with Tsering, he had weekly sessions. Again, there were 3 of us. I wasn't a very good student because I went faithfully to the classes, but at that time, I was working quite intensively on my day job, so I didn't do much homework. And then I mentioned Japan as being a bit of a distraction. Well, Japan was good in itself. There was a kind of break, because in 1996 I spent 3 months in Japan. I spent 3 months in Japan, so I then didn't continue. So that's a gap. As I say, I hope to do something to fill that gap. It's harder with advancing years. But the main way of filling that gap is to work with other people, and I need to do that anyway. So some regrets on that front, but not enormous regrets, because there are other things to do. So the way I think about it is, I mean, one of your questions was why am I interested in this topic? Well, part of the answer is another question, which is what can I do? And what I have done is part of what I can do, what I may yet do, what I hope yet to do. is what I can do. That will have a element of working with other people. That again leads me to stress the point about community. There are academic rivalries, there are academic feuds, but on the whole, more than on the whole, I think the Tibetan studies communities, because they overlap, and Ladakhi communities, they're really interesting people. They're interested people, and so I'm really happy to be part of that. I think of it as being a great privilege.
Yeah, we are happy too. And John, could you say a bit about your work in human rights and business risk consultancy? How does it look in practice, and how was it having in fact two careers throughout your life?
Is, because it still continues.
Yes, sorry, is.
Okay, so earlier I mentioned that coming back from India was a considerable culture shock, common experience. The culture shock continued when I joined a company and went to work in the suit every morning. Wow. No, it's okay. This is brilliant. Or another take may be helpful. So again, so I mentioned earlier that coming back from India to Britain was a reverse culture shock. That's quite a common experience. Joining a company was also in a way a kind of culture shock, wearing a suit every day, learning a different way of behaving. For me, it was like entering another country. Over the years, I guess I can say that I'm part of that other country. Maybe I even have citizenship, but it's also still a kind of foreign citizenship, or maybe I have, to continue the metaphor, I have a kind of dual citizenship. What is common is that many of the same skills apply. So the basic skills which come from a historian of absorbing information, communicating it in a way that makes sense. I actually think that's one of the things that makes me a better historical writer, because I'm used to communicating to people with short attention spans, 7-year-old children, but also business people in a hurry. You have to write succinctly, and I think those are helpful skills. I feel fortunate in that field, in that respect too, because I hope that by engaging in the anti-corruption field and human rights, I work for a commercial company, we have to make a return, but I hope it makes a wider social contribution. As stated earlier, so it's a personal view, in order to survive it has to be commercial, but underlying it, there are basically the same values. But I guess, okay, so, but there are some quite interesting contrasts. Maybe another take on that. There are some interesting contrasts. So recently I read an interview with the American, quite a famous political scientist called Joseph Nye, who was responsible for the phrase soft power. So he, at times in his life, I think more than one time, he'd worked for a government, and he was drawing a distinction between academic writing and writing for the government, and he made a point about timeliness. So if you're working in government, if you're a day late, your work may lose its value. So you need to be on time, you need to be succinct, and you may not achieve 100% perfection, whereas if you're an academic, the premium is getting things exactly right, and you may take ages getting things exactly right, which is why academics never meet deadlines for joint publications. So, of course, I recognize that. Many of the skills are the same, but my greater creative energies go into the academic writing. For that matter, I think those things will last. I actually do write a little bit of academic work in the other field as well. I write for other audiences.
Yeah, it's really impressive.
I guess there's a wider view also about human rights in relation to Tibet and China, and on that I have various views. I'm not currently involved in human rights in Tibet. I have been in the past. I guess that part of my life is not that I wish to have sections between different parts of my life too much, but that part of my life is more the business and human rights at the moment. I do think academics have, well, I would put it more broadly. I do think academics have I would put it quite strongly, I think they have a responsibility to speak to wider audiences. I don't think they're necessarily very good at it. In fact, I think that academic writing is often bad for communication skills instead of good for communication skills. But I think in their own interest, academics should be communicating more broadly to wider audiences. As I mentioned, blogs. It could be interviews like this one, which may read to a wider audience. But it's another and, not a but. And I do think that, for example, 14th century art history, Tibetan art history, has a wider value, which is important in the bigger picture. So in this case, showing that Tibet does have an independent, there you are, I'm using a political word, does have its own history. Also showing the interconnections, so there are interconnections with China and with India, showing that things are complex, making the complex understandable. That particular point, I mean, what I...
Yeah, that's all.
Okay, making the complex understandable. So that particular point has a wider resonance. So there are two things. One is that we intellectuals, we who think and we who write, we are talking about complexities. Part of the skills is analysing those complexities and communicating them. Much of the contemporary discussion is simplistic. We should be communicating in a straightforward way to show that things are not simplistic, but doing so in a way that is clear on our own subjects. And I think that if we're doing that, we're already making a significant contribution. But that doesn't relieve us of our political responsibilities, our responsibilities as citizens, and we definitely have those. So then again, I mentioned community contributions. I'm glad to be part of a set of overlapping academic communities. I think it's important to make contributions. So in that respect, I don't resent corvée labor, editing other people's texts. That's something I can offer. I think we're part of other communities too. Business and human rights, civic communities are there as well. For that matter, I don't do much formal teaching. I do quite a bit of informal helping with, I mentioned Ladakhi students, reading other people's chapters. I think these are all ways in which we contribute.
Would you also say that academics should contribute to human rights issues, maybe speaking to human rights, especially in Tibet? It's a difficult question.
I mean, it's a difficult question. So I think I would be a little bit careful about saying what any individual should do. Part of what I'm saying is that by doing what they already do, they are making a contribution, but maybe they should be thinking about broader audiences. So I get quite cross with people who say they're studying something which is too complicated to explain to other people. I'm going to make a value judgment. I think that attitude is, it is a value judgment. I have made so many in the course of this interview, but I'm now going to make one. I think it's arrogant and it's incompetent. Maybe I would stress the incompetent, or maybe I'd use a more neutral word, is unprofessional. As part of academic professionalism, we should be able to communicate. And the more sophisticated you are, the better you are at communicating. I've experienced this as an observer, listening to a philosopher expressing quite complex ideas simply, and I really admired him. I thought, wow, this is an enormous skill. It's true, not everybody has those skills, but we should all aspire to them. So again, you were asking me earlier questions about values. That is a value judgment, but I think it's intrinsic to what we are doing and what we should be doing. I'm impatient with the phrase ivory tower, because I don't think academics anyway are in ivory tower. They live in quite a politicized environment. We anyway live in the modern world. We have an opportunity to be engaged in the modern world in all sorts of ways. But I already think that, I use the analogy of 14th century art, that's already a way of being engaged with the wider world, organizing an exhibition which will be made accessible to a variety of different people. I think that's already a valid contribution. So you don't have to be marching in the streets against Brexit, although it would be a good idea. There are lots of ways in which we can be engaged, but I do think we have a responsibility to be engaged. So it is a value judgment, but I'm making it.
Yeah, thank you. And we have dedicated this project to Tsering Gonkatsang, who was our dear teacher in Oxford. And I know that you have worked with him. Mm-hmm. Can I ask you, what are your memories now of this work together? Or maybe how did your work with Tsering developed?
It's an important question, because I thought about it quite a lot. I thought about Tsering a lot, like you have. Okay, so a couple of things. So when Tsering passed away, I exchanged emails with Ulrike Rösler, and one of the things that Ulrike said was that Tsering was involved with all sorts of things that not many of us knew about, and once he passed away, then we started discovering things, and in fact we're still discovering things that he was involved with. So I can share some of those things, which maybe not everybody knew about how he and I worked together, and in sharing it, I'm conscious that it's only one of several things that he was working on. So, and I'm emphasizing that point because I'm not claiming a special relationship with him, but rather that his relationship with so many people was special. So I first knew Tsering quite early on. When he moved to London, he became part of the Tibet Foundation. In fact, I should also mention that I had briefly been studying some Tibetan with Phuntsog Wangyal, who started the Tibet Foundation. Phuntsog basically invited Tsering to take over. So I and others, we went to his house once a week. We studied Tibetan. I said I wasn't a very good student. Actually, I wasn't a very good student, but there is something of a basis there, and I do intend to get back to it, and will do. But then how our particular project then developed, we had one of the things I've been interested in for quite a while is a specific historical issue, and it's about a series of missions, diplomatic missions between Ladakh and central Tibet and Lhasa, which started in the 17th century and continued right until 1946. So in connection with those missions, another friend, so this is cooperation again, let me name him, Martijn van Beek, who's from Holland but based in Denmark. He shared some photocopies of documents which are in the Jammu archives from Tibet. So the first project we did was about those documents, 3 of them, which Tsering translated. And I presented them in the historical context, and that became our first joint contribution. The second one was a follow-up. It was actually based on a photograph in a book of another such document. It had the Dalai Lama's seal on it, so that was a shorter follow-up. And the third one, we went together. There are some Ladakhi documents in the British Library from the Gergen collection, collected by Joseph Gergen, the person I was talking about earlier. So he and I went together and we did a kind of preliminary search through those documents. It was sort of it was really rather impressive what happened. The documents produced in a great big box. We went at them up, visually looking at them, and Tsering would sort of point to them and then immediately start translating, almost as though he wasn't in a trance. But I mean, it was very quick and spontaneous, and I would be quickly typing rough notes. One of those documents we then wrote up. In fact, it was a joint contribution to Peter Schwieger's Festschrift, and it was a Ladakhi account of the enthronement of the Maharaj of Jammu Kashmir in 1889. And then the last project, unfortunately, which is still work in progress, was about some textbooks produced in Ladakh in 1933. I sent him a copy of one of the textbooks, and my initial question was actually, I didn't want to be too demanding, but I wanted to know his opinion. He didn't just give me his opinion, he basically translated the whole thing. First a short text and then a slightly longer. He did that without being asked, so he was spontaneous and very generous. His wife Dolka said that last project was ideal for him because it involved textbooks, so he was interested in it as a teacher. So that's sharing my experience. It's another mosaic in the life of Tsering. The last time that we met was shortly before he died. In retrospect, a couple of things. I mean, he mentioned then that he'd been having medical tests. And in fact, I'd forgotten about that until it wasn't uppermost in my mind until more recently Dolka mentioned that he is true. We met in the British Library. We sat in the canteen. I think he only had I'm not even sure whether he had a cup of tea, but he didn't eat anything because he was having hospital tests the following morning. So in retrospect, that was a kind of warning sign. I didn't think of it at the time. But we had 2 hours together, and without any particular intention, the 2 hours were a little bit like this meeting, because it was a kind of autobiographical interview. It started by me asking checking my memory. I knew some of these stories, but where he came from, and so it turned into a kind of autobiographical conversation about how Tsering's life had developed and how he had become what he had become. So, in Tsering's own words, there were two critical things. What was important to Tsering about his own role, and it was a double role. One was translating and one was teaching. So he talked about how his teaching career had developed. He talked about his earlier life in Tibet and leaving Tibet. He had been, after leaving university, he'd been in the army, but his career was put on hold because when Indira Gandhi came back, when she came back to power in 1977, I got it the wrong way around. When she lost power in 1977 after the emergency, he was going to become an officer, but then the Indian government said, let's wait a bit, let's review. So while he was waiting, he decided he got fed up waiting. He was going to become a teacher instead. And then there was a particular turning point. I've since discussed this with his wife, Dolker. He was already a teacher in Dharamsala in the early to mid 1980s. Samdang Rinpoche, who was then in Varanasi, was sending some advice to the Tibetan schools, which was that they should put more emphasis on the Tibetan language. So he sent this letter out in Tibetan. Tsering translated the letter from Tibetan into English for his fellow Tibetan teachers who themselves were not so good in Tibetan. And he sent a copy to Samdang Rinpoche, who was a great man. And Samdang Rinpoche sent the letter back, which greatly encouraged him. So that was a kind of turning point, which set him on his subsequent career as a translator. That part of his life. I'm reflecting on the time about that. How he described himself. He was somebody who was very happy about the way his life had turned out. He was fulfilled. He was unassuming in a completely natural way. He had no need to boast about anything because what he did spoke for itself. It wouldn't have occurred to him to boast about anything, but as I say, actually he had no need to if he did want to. So he was, in that respect, completely natural without artifice. That's a great thing to be. Not many of us are like that. Maybe it relates a little bit to my what I was trying to articulate earlier about how academics should be. They should be able to express complex ideas simply. That's something which he certainly did. What I wrote, so since he passed away, I've thought a lot about him. I guess I wrote first of all to Doug and his wife, and then I wrote something for the Oxford people, and I was allowed to be an honorary Oxford person, putting together a kind of folder for Dulker and his family about what he meant for us. What I wrote at the end was a considered view. I've been thinking a lot about Tsering, and of course I was thinking a lot about what Tsering himself would say, so I had a sort of imaginary dialogue with him. What he would say would be, don't make a fuss. I mean, he wouldn't say that. He would use a different idiom. I'm not sure exactly what he would say, but that would be the meaning of what he would say. And I would reply, well, how can we not? But nonetheless, what is the correct way of what is the appropriate way of responding? So the appropriate way of responding is to say la la so. Yes. The appropriate way of responding, though, is to build on what he gave us, and to take it a stage further, and to share it with other people. And that's what I'm trying to do, because the project we started on still hasn't been quite finished. That would be my conclusion, still my conclusion.
Yeah, thank you. That's also what we are trying to do. Could I also ask you whether you knew Michael and Anthony Aris?
Yes, and I've thought a lot about them too. So I knew Anthony first, and I guess I saw more of Anthony than of Michael. I met Anthony first in the 80s, and I think it was probably, I can be specific about what it was. It was the reception for His Holiness, who was coming to London, and so that's when I met him first. So I saw him on and off over subsequent decades. The last time that I definitely remember seeing him was in Oxford, and there was a kind of mini conference for when Charles Russell was leaving Oxford and going to Paris. I may have met him after that, but that's the last time that I definitely remember meeting him. I was glad to contribute to the volume which Charles and Ulrika put together. I knew Michael in a double connection, because I also worked a lot on Burma. So that's another side to my professional life, but also the human rights side of life. So the first time I met Michael was quite memorable. In fact, earlier I mentioned I published the Ladakh bibliography. It was actually published by Aris and Phillips, which Aris, of course, was his family, and he himself, his Bhutan book, was published by Aris and Phillips. In connection with my professional life, I knew an American who had had some contact with, some engagement with minority, in fact specifically Karen minority people in Burma. So already in 1989, Dol Su was already in Burma. I'd never met her. But this American, his name was William Overholt, he'd written an article about the Karen for Foreign Affairs, and he wanted to meet Michael. I guess he had an agenda, not a particularly sinister agenda, but maybe rephrase that. He felt that the position of the Karen should be better known, so that's why he'd written for Foreign Affairs. And I think he also hoped that Dol Su, who was had become a significant personality, would gain or reinforce a sensitive appreciation of their situation. So I'd never met Michael, but I was able to make contact with him because of the Aris and Phillips connection. We had dinner together. I was a little bit in awe of him. So I remember being rather awkward and probably a little bit socially clumsy, introducing these two people together, but it was fine. And I met him on various occasions after that in both connections. In the I mentioned the second Tibetan Studies conference I went to was in Norway, in Fagernes. 2 weeks later, so Michael was there, 2 weeks later, we met again at a different event in London. This time there was a Burma one, and there was an overlap of 3 people. There was me, there was Michael, and there was another quite significant person in this era who was Norwegian called Hal Kuløy. So I kept meeting Michael on and off in both Tibetan and Burma connections. In that period, I made 2 contributions in Oxford. I gave a talk in Wolfson, which was on Ladakh, and then I also gave a talk to the Strategic Studies Association or something, which was held in All Souls on Burma. I think Michael maybe wasn't at the Burma one, although I'm not quite sure. Maybe he was. So my relationship with him, I felt very much. Not I felt, it was very clear. I was junior to him in all these respects. I looked up to him. On Burma in particular, I felt the need to be very undemanding. So he was an extraordinarily difficult situation. I think he played his role with enormous tact and courage, and at great cost. And I admire him tremendously for that. One small thing which made me happy, I don't know whether it made him happy, particularly, in 1998, so not that long before he died, he passed away in March 1999. In October 98, I was in Melbourne, Australia, and following up various Burma contacts. And one of the people I met was a Burma campaigner, so we went to meet at a Burmese restaurant in suburban Melbourne. And on the wall of this restaurant, there was a picture of Michael, who had been at the restaurant earlier. And what I especially remember was the glowing picture of, not glowing face of the restaurant owner. He said, of course, we knew about Michael, but I never imagined he could come here. And I was so happy that here was somebody giving Michael just from the glowing of his face, the recognition that he so deserved. I told Michael about that afterwards. I think I probably told him by email. I don't think he responded. If I told him face to face, I think he would have shrugged it off. But for me, that was actually important because, I think Michael did get the respect that he deserved. And anyway, he was a low-key person. He never looked for extravagant expressions of respect. But I was so glad, this is my reaction, but I was so glad that he got it from this Burmese restaurant owner. How I knew him. So I knew him reasonably well, but I should say at a distance. So I felt, in retrospect, if I had asked him more questions, I asked him very little about Burma. I listened rather than asked. If I had asked, I'm sure he would have answered, and I'm sure he would have responded. But I nonetheless felt that I shouldn't. So if there were circles, I wasn't on the inner circle. I was in one of the circles. I don't know how far it was, but I'm grateful to be there. So that's more about Burma than it was about Tibet. But that was his life. Maybe a couple of things which bring the two together. One, encouragement in our lives. We get bits of encouragement. So he was on the editorial committee of the Fagernes, the Norwegian conference, the one in which I'd written about Joseph Goebbels, and so he sent me back comments in my paper. They were encouraging comments, so I was encouraged. I think I kept the slip of paper, but it may still somewhere, me somewhere. The other, maybe a combination of others, that I mean, at that dinner, the first dinner, so that was still 1989, it was still early days. Dosu had been, August 1988 was when it all started in Yangon, Rangoon. And Michael clearly, transparently, was trying to come to terms with what is going on and what it meant for his future. So he was asking my American colleague, whether there was some kind of research project that he could become involved with. And what he was thinking about was there are connections between northern Burma and Tibetan areas. So maybe there was something there which could be a way of bringing those sides of his life together. I guess continuing the same sort of thought, his book on Bhutan, the Raven Crown, he wrote out most of that book under house arrest for Dosu, and that for him had been a precious time. Basically just him and Dosu working productively. That was 1995. No, it was 1995. That might even have been their last time when they spent time together. I remember that quite vividly because I wrote for Chatham House Royal Institute of International Affairs, the think tank in London. I wrote a long piece about Burma. And that also, in my case, was a kind of overlap. I'd been to the third IATS conference, which I went to, which was in Graz, Austria, and then continuing my double life, whatever life it is. A week later, or 2 weeks later, I was presenting this discussion paper, quite a long discussion paper about Burma international relations, and it happened just at the time when there was a kind of dawn when Dosu was released from house arrest. And we all hoped that was going to be the beginning of the transition. In the end, it turned out not to be. I can't remember whether it was after that or before that that he spent that time with her. So, yes, I remember him very vividly and hold him in the highest respect. Anthony, of course, too. Mary-Laura's interview was both touching and amusing about how they complemented each other, and she said that to some degree Anthony took over the persona of Michael after Michael passed away. What she said makes sense, and of course she's the biggest authority, of course. She said it must be true. I'm not sure that I quite thought that. Maybe one other thing to add, because this should be added to the record. In 2001, the Ladakh Studies, our conference was in Oxford, and the Michael Aris Trust contributed to that conference. Anthony was there at that conference, so they contributed to that as well. That was part of the legacy. I mean, Michael respected him a lot, more than respected. But yes, I mean both. I'm talking about Michael more, but it doesn't entirely make sense to separate Michael and Anthony, of course. They were a combination. I don't think I ever saw them together in one room. That's strange now that I think about it, but I actually don't think I ever did. I don't know why not.
John, is there something else you would like to add to this interview, or should I go? We have like 3 concluding questions, the same for everyone. You can think a bit if you like.
Yeah, okay. So the interview is, it's another exercise in reflection and thinking about what all this means for me. So, at the end of the interview, maybe a couple of things. The single most important thing is the people. So, as I say, Tibetan studies, like any community, has its rivalries, plus points and minus points, but the people are really important. Another thing which is important for me, so it is the creative process. And so the opportunity to write, to discover, to ask questions, to have an audience, because I wouldn't have been doing these things with, would have been much, I probably wouldn't, I wouldn't have done them without people who occasionally read or respond to what we write. So I feel quite affirmative against utilitarian people who said that things have to have an economic value. I feel very affirmative. These things have an intrinsic value, which is really important. It's the same kind of value that art has or that music has. None of these things would mean anything without Ladakhis and Tibetans themselves. What they represent, and that too, very diverse, all of humanity is there, plus and minus, diversity, richness, greed, virtue, all these complexities. I don't think I romanticize either society. Some of the things I've written are quite critical. But nonetheless, it is, not nonetheless, or because of that, these societies are part of wider human society. They make a contribution which we should celebrate. Thinking about it with both Ladakhis and with Tibetans, thinking about the cooperation side, I think the scholarship really isn't. It could easily be about us and them. I actually don't think it is about us and them. And Tsering would be a kind of exemplar about that. He was interested in the questions we all asked, but he was sharing in the inquiry and sharing in the discovery. So those are the things that spring to mind as being particularly important. In my case, as I've said, I maybe never not in a somewhat reflective movement, but now looking back a bit, but also forward, so expressing an aspiration for the future, which is to build on what I've already done, to consolidate some of it, to share it, because I really do think that's important. And maybe that's also worth affirming. I've said that I don't like the ivory tower metaphors, but it really isn't true in my experience, or to the extent it is true, it's a distortion. We're very much part of a community. We do share things together. I do think, so again repeating this point, I think we don't all have to be political. Some people should, but we do have a responsibility to share what we're doing with other people and to develop the skills to do that. Some people will do it better than others. I guess this exercise is also part of sharing what we've been doing. That's probably enough.
So we have some concluding questions, but you have actually probably partly answered them. So let's see. So the first one is, what has your career in Tibetan or Ladakhi studies personally given to you? How has it enriched your life?
Yeah, so I hesitate a bit about the word career, although I think I have myself used the word. I think I say on my academia edu profile, which you were quoting earlier, I think I did use the word parallel career. So I can't protest about it, but nonetheless, it hasn't been a career in the sense it's never been my job. But how has it enriched my life? It's a really important part of it, and since I do live at least a double life, I'm constantly balancing. But for me, it's not how I earn my living. But of the two, it is the one to which I attach most value.
And what would you say was the more interesting, and what was the most interesting and most challenging part?
Well, the most, I guess so before I'm anything else, before I'm a political researcher, I guess I'm a historian, and the word historian is important. So and the most interesting part is still the people. We're at a conference, I was talking about this earlier, and reflecting on the idea of having a dialogue with texts. And I was recalling that I do think one has a dialogue with texts, with historical writing. I mentioned this to a Ladakhi student who said she thought it was rather spooky to think of having a dialogue with dead people. But you don't have to explain it like that. I mean, you can explain it in completely normal terms. We have a question, you look in the text for an answer, and sometimes you find it, and then it's not as though the writing is speaking to you, actually it is speaking to you, and then you have another question, and then maybe you get another answer. But you never get complete answers. So you're always looking to try and fill the gaps. You gradually get better insights, never complete insights. But that also is a kind of relationship. It's a process. You're filling gaps, bits of information which you collected years ago. Now, in my case, it could be decades ago. Suddenly become useful. So that it's not a thing, it's a process, is the most interesting bit. That's probably also the most challenging bit. I guess so I've explained my relationship with the language, and I'm conscious of the weakness. It's a shortcoming, and I've also explained how I address the shortcoming by working with other people. So I'm conscious, for example, that there are a whole vast depths of complexity, philosophical complexity in Buddhism, with which I'm basically not engaging. In which case it's not a challenge because I'm not engaging with it. So I'm conscious that there are vast areas of knowledge in this particular area, as well as in knowledge altogether, of which I have very little understanding. I mean, in a way, it's a kind of trick question, because you ought to be challenged if you knew about it. The things we don't know about it would be challenging if we knew about them, but if we're ignorant, we don't know about them, and so we live in blissful ignorance. Sorry, I'm not sure whether that makes sense. Cut that one out, probably. maybe the summing up is that is most interesting, but is also most challenging. This process of engaging with another culture, where there's always something more to learn, where it's interesting because thinking processes are different, but is also challenging, and there's always the possibility that we're completely missing things. The excitement is when something comes together, when we see some insight which we otherwise previously would have missed.
So, John, what is there that you would still like to pursue in the future?
Okay, so lots of things. One thing which I haven't mentioned, but perhaps I might mention, I like being a historian. I also like being engaged with contemporary issues. There's a small aspect of that which I might mention. It's a bit of a one-off, but important and satisfying. Just recently, in the last year, I've been working with a colleague in Singapore who is a geographer who's a specialist in floods. Last year, we organised a workshop in Ladakh, and I was contributing a variety of different skills. One was history was important because I knew about historical sources of floods, helping run the workshop and then writing up the paper. So it was nice to use skills and contacts in a different way, which was of a different contemporary value. So that in fact does meet the utilitarian test. It's nice to do that. But more substantively, so I've never been particularly good at planning. I haven't had a life plan. I often think I should have a life plan, but actually I've never had a life plan. To the extent I have had perhaps a kind of working strategy, and the working strategy is to do with the papers I've been writing. I read the paper, whatever happens, I've written the paper, it's there. That's some kind of legacy. But, or it's another but, which is also an and. But and. I would like to consolidate what I've written and take it further. So it's consolidate and take further. And but and I also have a question about, do I continue doing a double life, or should this actually become the single life, or the main focus? I'm coming to a time where that could be a serious option. So 3 projects. The question is whether to do them sequentially or one by one, or quite how to do it. One is to bring together the biographical articles into a kind of collection. I'm actually struggling with that at the moment, and the problem I'm grappling with is to do with coherence. To what extent do they need to be united by a common theme? Quite good at knitting together disparate things, but I'm not quite satisfied with that. A second one. So I've written a series of papers which I quite like individually, give some satisfaction individually, which come into the category of social economic history, and then to do with Ladakh and Western Tibet. I have some more gaps that I want to fill. Publishing them as an anthology doesn't work. It wouldn't be satisfying because both because of the gaps, but also because there's some overlap between the various papers, and further because the ones I wrote a while ago I now know more, so I would want to recast them. So that would be another potential project, to consolidate and take them further, not just summarize. And then the other one, should I do this first because it's the most important one, or should I do it last because I'm building up to it and have been building up to it for a long time? I've been collecting material on, one of them is Christians and Christianity, Christian missions, but it's more than that. It's Christianity and Buddhism. It's my contribution to Christianity and Buddhism. So again, to repeat, my contribution isn't philosophical. It isn't primarily philosophical. It is philosophical because it reflects a certain set of values, but it's not philosophical in the technical academic sense. I have for years had in mind to write a broader comparative history, and the questions are how broad, and when I start, and am I trying to do too much, sometimes being more focused on a smaller topic is the best way to go forward. So I guess where I am now, I think I'm rich. I think I'm rich in the sense that I have things of value, knowledge, contacts, not finance. That's not what I'm referring to. And how to use those and take them a stage further. I'm conscious that life is transient. There have been plenty of recent lessons in that. So I don't know whether any of those things will happen. But I hope they will, and I think I have grounded hope they will. I guess I'm reaffirming. I keep reaffirming. It's not just to reassure myself, but I'm reaffirming because I feel greater confidence in this than I might have done. That this stuff is actually important. And again, I'm expressing a value which does relate to where I come from. So about being part of wider communities. It's also about connections. So there's a relatively narrow group of community, the people who've been at this workshop. We know each other for a while. They're part of a wider Tibetan studies community. We're all part of our university communities. I'm part of university communities, even if I don't belong to a university. These things are of value, and we should be confident about it, not apologetic. I would even feel really quite militant. It's almost a contradiction about being militant about the humanities. Should we be militant? We should be militant about economic issues. Of course we should. But I really think the humanities have a contribution to make, and I feel confident in asserting that. And I think we should be asserting it. So maybe some of us may be by nature shy and retiring. I think we should be affirmative. And these are among the things which I wish to affirm.
Thank you. And then, John, can I ask you, we are conducting this project also for contemporary and future students, for students and researchers, but would you have a piece of advice?
Okay, so and there are a couple of things. So what I mean, one question which people ask me is how do I combine these different areas of life? Life is an important word. It is life, living different areas of interest. And I don't have a single answer because a lot of it is personal. It's to do with one's wider support network. I have my wife Miyoko is supportive. We don't have children. It'd be nice if we did, but we don't have that distraction. I've been fortunate in the work I've been doing, which has allowed that possibility. So I wouldn't offer myself or any one individual as a role model. I think our lives tend to be specific and quite difficult to replicate, and not worth replicating, not having that inspiration. But nonetheless, there are some things. One is by way of encouragement, so say that stuff actually is important, so value what you're doing. I guess another is say the opportunity of what you're doing. So you are making the opportunity. You're spending years of your life. That might seem like a sacrifice. But it's opportunities, to make the most of those opportunities of being at university, of meeting people in other topics. Maybe another is the long view. So my own route has been slow but cumulative. It's not the only route. There are lots of career reasons why you have to be some people have to be in a hurry. They have to get the publications done. But there are other ways of doing things. So slow but cumulative is one option. I guess another one, so learning from things you have done and things you haven't done. I mean, it's a sort of contradiction, but I do think language is really important. So take the opportunities to work on language when you can. It's a kind of gift. I also have that. Here I am in Germany. By English standards, my German is quite good. It's not as good as German people who work in English every day. Their standard of English is better than my German, but nonetheless, thinking of gifts, the basic German and more than basic German and French skills are a gift that I've been given. Sometimes you should ask for these gifts. So you are going out of your way to study Tibetan. You're not waiting passively. You're seeking, do that. Work hard on the language. Spend time talking to people. Instead of anthropologists, different disciplines, anthropologists themselves say, what are we doing? It's all about gossip. Well, okay, that's fine. Gossip is important. Sit around, talk to people, cafe culture. I'm not sure that any of that is very profound. If it's all very well for me to say take the long view, because when you're in a difficult situation you can't take a long view, or when you're in a hurry you can't take a long view, but I can't say take a long view, but I can say there is a long view, and maybe at least to imagine that perspective when you have to take a short-term view may be somewhat helpful.
Okay, thank you very much, John. Thank you.
No, thank you.